Hi, and welcome to the Art of Film Funding. I'm your co-host, Claire Papin, along with writer-producer Carol Dean, author of the best-selling book, The Art of Film Funding, and host of this show. Carol is the president of From the Heart Productions, a nonprofit organization that has supported filmmakers with the Roy W. Dean Grant, fiscal sponsorship, education, and resources for over 30 years. Carol also teaches the Learn Producing class. Each class features an industry expert guest instructor and is designed to give the information, guidance, and support to become a successful producer. You can learn more about this class and all of From the Heart Productions offerings at FromTheHeartProductions.com.
I'm Carol Dean, president of From the Heart Productions. Join us to learn new guidelines for AI to prevent false historical information. This is important.
Our very special guest today is Rachel Antell. She's worked in documentary film production for over 2 decades, but found her true passion in archival producing. In 2014, she co-founded Sub-Basement Archival, where she's had the honor of being archival producer on dozens of documentaries that have screened worldwide and garnered Focal Awards and an Emmy nomination for research and use of archival footage. In 2023, Rachel co-founded the Archival Producers Alliance, also known as APA, with Jen Petrucelli and Steph Jenkins. The APA was created to organize archival producers, educate the film community about the craft, and advocate to make archival materials accessible and affordable to independent filmmakers. The APA's first initiative addresses generative AI's impact on documentary film and archival work. Last year, the APA published the first industry-wide guidelines, Best Practices for Use of Generative AI in Documentaries, with endorsements from over 50 organizations, foundations, production companies, and film festivals, as well as dozens of filmmakers. And Carol, this is very important information for documentary filmmakers.
Yes, it is. It's a new world and we have to keep up. But thank you very much, Rachel, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So I want to understand the Archival Producers Alliance, its mission, and perhaps an overview of your mission in the documentary industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for people who don't know what archival producers do, our work involves researching, licensing, and also verifying the audiovisual archival materials that are used in all kinds of media, but primarily in documentary films. And so in the spring of 2023, my partner and I started seeing synthetic historic images being brought into documentaries, and they were indistinguishable from the real historical images that we were bringing in. So given our role as like fact checkers of third-party media, this raised big questions and concerns for us, both about how this wouldn't somehow muddy the historical record, and then also how documentary as a form would maintain its commitment to historical truth and the trust that it had built with audiences. So my colleagues, Jen Petrucelli, Steph Jenkins, and I gathered a group of archival producers from around the country to discuss how generative AI could impact archival work as well as the documentary field more broadly, and whether there was anything we could do to move the needle. And that led us to collectively writing and releasing an open letter that outlined the concerns and was printed in full by The Hollywood Reporter. It was signed by over 100 practitioners. And through the process, we found that people across the documentary industry really were hungry for guidance. They knew that this technology was, coming fast and furious into their world. and wanted to understand how to use it responsibly if they were, how to consider whether they wanted to use it, and then if they did, how to use it responsibly. So we formalized our group as the Archival Producers Alliance, or APA. And then in conversation with people across the documentary field, as well as lawyers and scholars and technologists, we wrote this set of best practices that are really born of the values that the documentary community has always held. And that was really the goal. I mean, because we knew that within the tech field, there are a lot of other people who are doing work around quote unquote ethics of AI and creating their own standards around it. And that's great. But we didn't believe that their primary interest was necessarily the protection of the documentary field. So our work was very intentionally grassroots because we felt that any set of standards, for it to be embraced by the documentary community, it really needed to come from the community itself.
Absolutely. From the Heart has given many grants to documentary films. We really find they're so enlightening and so very important to bring issues to light. And you're right, we've grown accustomed to documentaries going through rigorous standards and research and fact checking. And so, and it's not been easy to get people to believe them. And now, just recently, this month, there is a Swedish film called Watch the Sky, and that has had the language change from Swedish to English. And so this shows you what can happen, meaning that you could take a picture of any person in the educational field, the historical field, the entertainment field, and you can take that picture and put it in an AI that will allow it to say anything. So how we keep up with what's true and not true is a very important thing to work on for the future, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I think most people at this point would say they don't really trust media that is on the internet. They don't trust what's going on. But I believe that so far we still have trust in documentaries, but that's a very easy thing to be lost.
Yeah.
And trust is an easy thing to lose and a very difficult thing to build, to gain back. And when you sit down to watch a documentary, you make certain assumptions. And one of them is that what you're seeing is true. It's truth from a point of view, absolutely, but there is a basic truth to it. And it was something that was witnessed by a human at a particular moment in time, and that a human bearing witness is part of that. And when something is created out of AI, that's absolutely not the case, which was something we considered a lot when we were writing the guidelines. But Gen AI it's changing our understanding of the future, but it can also change our understanding of the past. And it's really brought with it the ability to rewrite our history, both through the creation of fake historical imagery, but also through sowing doubt in authentic historical imagery. So,
Yes. My goodness. All right. Well, how does the APA define ethical use of AI in documentary filmmaking, and what core principles guided this development?
right. So I wouldn't say that we specifically define ethical use. I think that might be a little broader. We set out a set of standards and a framework for people to use as they consider their usage. I mean, one thing to remember is that the technology is changing extremely rapidly. It keeps evolving much faster than we can keep up with it. So we didn't want to write guidelines that would become obsolete, in a month or 6 months or something. I mean, we will update them periodically, but we wanted it to be broad enough that people could consider um, the basic principles and then look at their own uses within those. So we identify 4 basic areas for people to consider. The first one is the value of primary sources. And primary sources we use that sort of interchangeably with archival evidence, actual archival. The second is transparency, and that's really the heart of the guidelines. You never want your audience to be confused about whether what they're seeing is real or synthetic. We know that people are using AI creatively. We don't want to indicate that there's something wrong with that, but there's something wrong if your audience doesn't know that this is a creative element rather than a historical element. The third thing we talk about is legal issues, which are also evolving very rapidly, and we want filmmakers to stay on top of those and understand what the potential implications are, and that what the implications are when they begin production, if it's a long production. And I've worked on films that take 10 years to go from pre-production to being aired, that those could be changing over the course of the production. So it's important to stay on top of it and work with a lawyer who does know what's going on. And then the fourth one is the ethical considerations of creating human simulations. And that kind of gets to what you were talking about earlier, Carol. You know, we sometimes call human simulations deep fakes. And what that means is taking a real person, a historical, someone who existed, and having them say or do something that they didn't actually say or do. So it's creating a fake voice, a fake body, a fake face, but you think, you know, the audience might think that they're seeing this actual person. And we felt that even beyond transparency, there's such a great risk in doing that, that even beyond transparency, there are other ethical things that you should be thinking about when you're doing that in the context of a documentary. So those are the four basic ones, and then each one has a lot of issues to consider within it. Yeah, so I don't know if you want me to keep going with that
Yes,
or.
well, I'd like to understand because you talked about verification, the value of the primary sources of
Yeah.
narrative. So how did the filmmakers tell the audience this is real and this is not, or this we created? How did they do that?
How do they do that? What are the methods for transparency? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
So we're definitely not prescriptive about methods of transparency. And I can't imagine a filmmaker who would even read the guidelines if we were, because, you know, filmmakers own their creativity and their artistic vision. We give some, but the bottom line is just that you don't want the audience to be confused. So there are a lot of different ways that filmmakers are discovering that they can be transparent. Some of the ones that we mention in there, just to give ideas, are it could be integrated into the visual language that you're building for your film. So we've seen filmmakers playing around with using a specific color wash on material that has been generated or altered using generative AI. We've seen people use a special frame around it so the audience it cues the audience that this is a distinctive creative element within the film. It's not historical footage. We've also seen used to great success times when filmmakers have integrated the disclosure into the body of the film, into the story itself. Now, some stories lend themselves to that and some don't. One film that I think does this to great success is a film called Another Body,
Mhm.
which the filmmakers were incredibly intentional and used, really spectacular care in their use of generative AI. So it's a documentary. It's by Sophie Compton and Ruben Hamlin. They're the filmmakers, and the film is about deepfake pornography and the people who have been harmed by it. And they had some of the people who had been harmed by it within the film, but they didn't want to expose their identity. So the filmmakers used the same technology that was used to create the deepfake porn as a way to obscure their identity.
Yes.
And about 13 minutes into the film, they have the characters themselves reveal. They say, what the story we're telling you is completely true, but the face you're seeing is not my face, and the voice you're hearing is not my voice. And it's very powerful for the audience. It in no way detracts from the story. It really deepens the story. Obviously not a lot of films are going to lend themselves to that, but often a narrator can, or a character within the film can say, because another use that people have is from there are a lot of groups of marginalized people who's haven't had a lot of archival material created about them, either because it's been suppressed or it never existed in the first place. And in order to tell certain stories, we know that filmmakers want to create Gen AI to be able to show some histories that haven't been seen before. And I think acknowledging that within the context of a story is also powerful, for audiences to understand just how little exists about certain histories. So I don't think it has to be seen as a detraction from a film. I think the disclosure itself can even be additive. Now, another method, the most common thing that people are doing is either including a card at the beginning saying that generative AI, and we say Gen AI sometimes, generative AI was used in the making of this film or to create certain elements, either in the front or the back. And that's great. I think that's important, but we rarely think it's enough to just have that. And the reasons are that, first of all, people don't always tune in for the beginning of a film or stay through the end credits. So they may completely miss that piece of information. And then the other problem with it, or the other limitation of it, is just that it's not specific. So it may even confuse the audience more because they know now that generative AI has been used within the film, but they don't know where or for which things. So then they may not trust other pieces that are authentic. So that's kind of the limitation of that. And we do get a little more specific in saying, some uses of generative AI are more concerning than others. So let's say that you use it just because you don't want to pay for stock footage to show a shot of an ocean. Okay. Well, that is generated. It's not real, but it also doesn't necessarily change our understanding of history. And so in a case like that, maybe it is enough just to have something at the front saying some of the B-roll in this was created by using generative AI. But if it's more specifically taking someone from history or showing a historical moment, then we really think that it's important to be clear that that clip, that moment, that photograph, is known, that specific moment is known to be generated. So does
Okay.
that make sense?
Yes, yes. To pinpoint it, get really specific about it to make people feel comfortable. Yes, I would appreciate that if I was watching something. And I think that would be make you feel that we're back to honesty here with the documentary filmmakers, because they go to great lengths to give you information for you, mainly you, to make a decision what you think about this issue, right? They show both sides, modes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the last thing any documentary filmmaker wants is to lose the trust of the audience, because then you've lost them. You put all this work into making a documentary film, and if the audience doesn't trust the person who's walking them through the story, the filmmaker, then, that completely undermines the film and the point of the film. And, I don't think no documentary filmmaker wants that. And we want people to believe that there is something different in a between a documentary and a docudrama. I mean, there are other forms. There's historical fiction, there's docudrama, and those are all totally legitimate forms of filmmaking. They're great forms of filmmaking, but they are different, and the audience comes in with different assumptions. And I think when you're making a documentary, you want to speak to the assumptions that the audience is coming in with. They sat down specifically to see a story where the filmmaker was being very honest and transparent with the audience about the historicity of what they're showing you.
Right. Did you want to explain any more of your guidelines specifically?
Oh,
Please.
sure. Well, going back to the value of primary sources, there are a few things that we want people to think about. The first is how the generative AI that you're creating might impact our understanding of the past, because synthetic material that is indistinguishable from true archival risks being passed along. You know, moments of documentaries are always, we see this all the time, pulled out, and they make their way onto the internet, and they make their way into educational materials and into additional, into other documentaries. And they will then be taken as truth because they've been shown in your film. Your film is part of the historical record. So once they get pulled out and moved into, the general info stream, they are suddenly truth, and they can change, they can forever muddy the historical record. The second thing we advise filmmakers to think about is the role played by algorithmic bias, both in reinforcing stereotypes as well as overcompensating or overcorrecting to combat stereotypes. And we've seen that happen with the technology. And each software, or each different type of generative AI, each company has different biases written into it. So the way that generative AI works in a large language model, which a lot of these things like Midjourney and, Dolly and all these are, is that they've scraped, enormous amounts of information from the internet
Right.
and from, what the media that's on the internet. Now, one of the things is that as archival producers, we know only a very tiny amount of the archival media that exists is actually on the internet. So that is, you're just going to be getting a very small sample that already is going to be biased. We know that the archive, even more generally in its completion, is also biased. And then, you put that on top of that, just the part that's made it to the internet, and then the way whatever the biases are of the actual software. So often stereotypes get amplified. And that's a problem. We've seen that, over time, we keep checking back in with the software to see how much bias is in there. And the companies are aware of this too, and they keep playing with the algorithms to change it. And so some of the things we'd seen, like when the film that I mentioned earlier that we had been working on, this was almost 2 years ago now. And all of the women that were created in it, they looked like Angelina Jolie, like that, very specifically Angelina Jolie. And there are supermodels and actresses are very disproportionately represented in the depictions of women on the internet. So that was what was being created. Um, so there's that level of problem. There's terrible racial biases that we've seen, coming up. There was a time, yeah, I mean, I won't even repeat them because why do that? But we've seen those things happen when you put in a certain prompt that's very general and it brings up a certain race or a certain, gender for those things. And that's problematic. And then the overcorrection that we've seen happening is, there was this one moment, and maybe it's comical, maybe it's not, but like Google ended up having to apologize because their software, Genesis, was creating these images of African American Nazis, which is ridiculous because they were overcorrecting to make sure there was representation from all races in everything. So the point being, and then one thing I'll mention about bias is when we were writing the guidelines, we really struggled with, well, humans are biased. We know that, absolutely. And there's biases in all media. So what's really the difference between human bias and algorithmic bias? And one of the things we came up with that I think holds is that when a human piece of media shows bias, you know who the author is, and you can hold them accountable, and you can wrestle with their bias and argue it and debate it and contextualize it. But when there's an algorithmic bias showing in a piece of media, a machine-made piece of media, there's no way to do that. There's no way to take apart where it came from because it's just a blend of a million different things. So you can't engage with it and interrogate the bias in the same way, which I think adds a layer of danger to it.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
Anyway, so that, and then just one other thing we mention in terms of primary sources is we really believe that the questions posed by generative AI are on a continuum with many other things that documentary filmmakers have wrestled with forever, including and especially those raised by creating reenactments in documentary. That's been happening for a long time, and there's been a lot of debates within the community about reenactments. And we think it's on a continuum with that, but that it poses a greater risk because generated imagery requires so little time and expense to produce that it doesn't lend itself to the same kind of rigor. If you're putting in the time and money that's required to, film actors with sets and costumes and pay a cinematographer and lighting, you're going to really do your historical research because you don't want to have to go back and do that again. So we want people to bring that level of care and that level of intentionality to the creation of a synthetic image that they would have brought to a reenactment. So that's just one thing and a final thing we call attention to around the issue of primary sources.
I would say that is very important because it is expensive. Recreations can be very expensive, but yet they really move the story forward. They're important. Sometimes it's the only way to get that point across. And yes, I would think that that would be one of the first things that would go to AI because you could do it so much cheaper. So your point is that you want them to be very careful and maintain the integrity
Yes.
of what their statement is, right? And not to let
Yeah. And
AI.
their process, the integrity of the process. I mean, the thing about AI, we don't want to see I think there's a concern about AI coming in just to solve problems of money and time. Now, every documentary filmmaker has both those problems. There is never enough money for your film. There is never enough time for your film, but especially money. And then AI just falls from the sky and answers all your problems. But it creates other ones down the line. And that's what we really want people to consider. We don't want it to be seen just as a shortcut. There are a lot of wonderful creative uses of generative AI, and I think that filmmakers will be able to do really great things with it, but we just don't want them to sacrifice that kind of intentionality and care and time and consideration. Um, it shouldn't be less rigorous. It can't, if it's just a shortcut, it's going to really, I think, endanger the form of documentary. But used, with the same intentionality and care as you would other tools, it could be great and elevate it. So we're not, we definitely don't, we are not anti-AI at all. We're just, pro rigor and care and, upholding all the things the documentary form has always stood for.
You're looking at the future and what could happen. And you're very smart to do that because if we lose our trust in documentaries, I mean, that would be the worst thing possible. Because I always am so happy to watch a documentary because I know these are facts. If you get your E&O insurance and you go through all the legal procedures, everything in there you can believe. And that's where we want to keep it. There's your
That is my point, and that is a real concern. It's a concern on many levels. The idea of history being rewritten or people not trusting what they see is scary. I mean, most people share a belief that the moon landing happened, that the Holocaust happened, that the Kennedy assassination happened. And when doubts are raised, there's always been documentary proof to keep them in check. But in the very near future, that kind of visual evidence could be rendered meaningless. And the scope of the problem is pretty staggering. In a single recent year, there were 15 billion synthetic images generated. And that was like a year and a half ago. So that number is growing. But for context, that is the same number as were created by humans during the first 150 years of photography. So the deluge of generated content is just arriving faster than we can process its implications. And that's kind of the concern that led us to create these guidelines, and also is now having us, we're starting to work directly with archives themselves too about just sort of safeguarding their collections against the infringement of Gen AI, because we don't want anything sowing doubt in these guardians of our collective history, which is what archives really are.
Exactly. That's very important. Well, I noticed that you've been endorsed by many major players in the industry, NBC, Universal Academy, and over 30 production companies. So how did you do that?
Yeah, that we felt that was a really important part of our process. We didn't want it to just be, here we are, these like archival producers setting up the guidelines. So this was done, there was a very involved process. The first thing we did when we started writing the guidelines was we were in conversation with the International Documentary Association, the IDA, and they invited us to present a draft of the guidelines at their Getting Real conference in April of 2024. So in the writing of the guidelines, we did talk with just numerous, fair use attorneys or, like copyright attorneys, those kind of, those people, E&O insurers. Actually, we spoke with E&O insurers. We spoke with people in standards and practices. We spoke with a lot of people who are technologists to really understand AI. And we spoke with film scholars and a lot of filmmakers. So we felt that we had thought through a lot of the issues, but you don't know. So we went to the conference, and we had a panel that was attended by, a couple hundred people, and we got their feedback. And then we rewrote, or, we amended the guidelines based on their feedback. And then we sent it out to hundreds of filmmakers and got more feedback. So that by the time we were finalizing the guidelines, which was around June-ish, we already were in conversation with people really across the industry, and we had their input on a lot of these issues, which we felt was important for building visibility and also trust in the work that we had done. And then we began asking for endorsements. So we were in conversation. It was a lot of, and you can see the full list on our website of the people and organizations that have endorsed. But that's an important thing because then they're also the ones who are passing those along. And the guidelines have influenced a lot. At this point, the NEH has said that they've been, incorporating our guidelines into their thinking. We've been consulting with Sundance and the IDA around the common app for funding. We've spoken with funders. PBS standards and practices is utilizing the guidance. So even places that haven't endorsed are actually pretty involved in conversation with us.
Wonderful.
A lot of them. So it's exciting. I mean, we feel like because a lot of different streamers have and places have their own guidance, but it's very opaque and it's not all the same. So if you're an independent producer, and like I, as an archival producer, work with sometimes on big, films that are being sponsored by streamers, but often on independent films who don't know where their film is going to end up. And it's a very confusing territory for them because for an independent producer, you make your film and then you go to sell it and you don't know what the standards are going to be of whoever it is you're selling it to down the road. And it may turn out that you have to go back and redo some things within your film if you've used generative AI, if you don't know what their standards are. So we're working towards having a more universal type of standard.
And do you see these standards evolving into industry-wide policies?
I mean, yes, absolutely. That would be ideal. And it's a slow process. And it should be a slow process. It's not like we think anyone should just be jumping on this. There's a lot to consider. And, it's an overused expression, but we're building the plane as we fly it because, the technology and legal landscapes are just changing so rapidly. And we're trying to change with it. And and be in touch with as many people as possible. I mean, documentary doesn't have a central body that makes decisions for it. So there isn't really anything that everyone's agreed upon in that way. It's much less formal than that. So we know that that's the ecosystem, and we're just trying to get it to be, we're trying to start conversations basically and create a framework for those conversations to happen within.
Great. Well, what about international documentaries that we have no control over, but they'll be distributed in America? How are you
Yeah.
going to handle that?
Well, honestly, I feel a little less worried because it's almost more the other way around. Like everything's looser in the US, like Canada's ahead of us and England, the UK is ahead of us. So it's more, and like the EU has standards that we don't have. So it's more like if you're making a film in the United States and you want international distribution, it's more likely that your film won't meet the standards there than the other way around.
They set their standards early then.
Yeah, they did. The EU was ahead of us. And we've been in conversation with people, certainly from the UK and Canada, about their thinking because they were ahead of us, absolutely. But I mean, these are conversations that are happening internationally. Our guidelines are currently translated into Spanish, French, Italian, Russian, Japanese, and German, with hopefully more languages coming down the pike. And I will say the translations were all done by humans, none of them done by AI. That was important to us.
So beyond AI, are there any other emerging issues in archival production that the APA is addressing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are also a membership organization. And so we recently came out with a set of guidelines or for working with archival producers. And that felt important because people don't know, even within the documentary field, people don't always understand what archival producers do or what the value of having an archival producer on your team is. And so we wanted to lay that out as well as just give tips for how to get the most out of working with an archival producer, how you get the most value added for your production and what that really is about. And so that's exciting. And we did a webinar with the Documentary Producers Alliance and the Alliance for Documentary Editors to kind of get that guide into their hands, which was exciting. Eugen Bronig and Deborah McClatchy were the primary authors on that, and they did that. The IDA covered it in their magazine last month. So that's one thing we're doing, is getting greater visibility. We're also advocating for archival producers with awards organizations, trying to get more recognition for archival producers in that way. We recently did a pay survey as well, because archival producers are always freelance. We're always, or almost always, working in that way, and it's very hard to know. We're all very siloed. And so we really are trying to create a forum for people to come together and share the issues and understand what's happening in other parts of the country for archival producers, and protect our field as well, because, Gen AI is dangerous for the archival world too, for archival producers and for archives for sure.
Right.
Absolutely. The archives, it's an existential moment for them.
Well, how can people get involved with you? Should they go to your website and read all of this information? Is that
Yeah, definitely come to the Archival Producers Alliance website, which is www.archivalproducersalliance.com. We're com. Yeah. And we have, yeah, you can sign up to be a subscriber. We send out like a quarterly newsletter about the work that we're doing. There's always new things on the website. We're membership funded, basically. We have some grants, which is great. We certainly need more. It's a hard, world out there for everyone right now. But we are doing this work. One exciting thing that we have coming up is we have been building a toolkit for documentary filmmakers who want to use generative AI in their productions. So it's like a companion to the standards if you don't want to sit and read. And our guidelines are not that long, by the way. They're like 11 pages. It's not onerous, but even hopefully more accessible is the toolkit that we're coming out with, where one of the exciting things is we're releasing a cue sheet that people can use to track their generative AI usage, because that's going to be very important for filmmakers to show to their legal team, to their distributors or streamers. We want to really make it really easy for filmmakers to create these cue sheets like they would for archival materials, like they would for music. This should just be a standard part of production at this point if you're using any kind of generative AI. So the toolkit has all kinds of things like that. It has a workflow chart where you really, with all of what you should be thinking about at different stages of pre-production, production, post-production, and distribution if you're using generative AI. And the toolkit is due to come out on April 2nd, fingers crossed. We're currently beta testing it with people in the industry, but that will live on our website and is, free for any filmmakers to use.
wonderful? It's free and it'll be on your website April 2nd on.
Correct.
Oh my gosh. And that will it suggest any AI programs that you have found are good to use?
That's a good question. That maybe in the next phase of the toolkit, yes, that is something we're looking for doing. We do have resources. We have a whole special resource section that may point to aggregators for the software. We have not done that yet. And it's complicated because there are so many different issues to consider when you're choosing a software. There's the underlying copyright of the materials that the Gen AI has scraped from, and sometimes that's known and sometimes that's not known. Large LLMs don't. There's a lot of exciting work being done with small language models, I think, which will be a little bit cleaner in that way. But we are not yet a total clearinghouse for all the ins and outs of each different type of software, but that is part of what we're looking at. Yeah.
So you've just thrown something out that's incredibly interesting. In other words, you really have to research the program you're using to find out what the source of their information is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a difference between something, something like a Midjourney that's just scraped from the internet, and something, I mean, I guess I shouldn't call any specific things out, but there are places that are offering generative AI where they are guaranteeing that everything's been pulled from licensed media or media that they own the license to. So they're kind of guaranteeing you that this was sourced on all, your copyright is free and clear. And the law is not settled yet on how much of a problem it is if you've used Gen AI that is scraping from copyrighted material. There's a lot of cases, and we do follow. We have some legal trackers that are tracking the legal cases as
Yes.
they're coming out. That is one of our resources, and that'll be important to follow. But as yet, the law is really unsettled. And different, and I mentioned that streamers don't necessarily are being a little more opaque. I think they're really watching the laws closely too, because they don't want to find themselves on the wrong side of anything either. But a lot of it is unsettled, and you sort of have to make your decisions before about what AI you're using before those are settled. So I guess, a lot of people are trying to go for the safest thing they can find. And again, we just really stress that it's important to talk with a lawyer at, early and late in your use of this. That's not a step that should be bypassed. And we know it's expensive, but there are some great lawyers dealing with this. And there are also some, we point people to, like, UCLA has a free clinic around this, and so does Cardozo, I think, in New York, that can, help filmmakers pro bono.
Well, my attorney, Robert Siegel, highly praises you for the work you've done.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Thank you. Thank you.
So that is good when attorneys are saying, oh, you have to go listen to what they have to say. It's really important. I think that's great.
I love to hear that. Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, and we have been talking to lawyers. Like, it was important to us that we weren't, obviously, and we got some criticisms of our first draft from lawyers about ways that what we were saying could impact the legal landscape for documentarians in negative ways around fair use and stuff. And we did change, obviously, everything that was in there that could, because we certainly do not want to do anything that could have any negative impacts on any of that, even though this is not a legal document. That's something I should have said at the head. What we have created is not a legal document. It is strictly an ethical one. But even that, we were told, can have impact. So
it has a big impact. Thank you so much for the work you've done. This is true dedication to the documentary field. Greatly appreciated, Rachel. Well, I thank you very much for the information you've given us. I know our filmmakers will love it, and I hope that they'll be going in droves to your website and adhere to your policies.
Yeah.
And I'm looking so forward to the April 2nd release date for the toolkit. Well done.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Claire, for the show, and we'll be back with more information. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Be well, everyone. Now, in its second edition, Carol Dean's popular book, The Art of Film Funding, has 12 new chapters to cover all areas of film financing and how to avoid expensive pitfalls. Learn how to start with an idea and end with a trailer, how to make an ask for money, create your story structure and your trailer, legal advice, fair use, successful crowdfunding, how to ask for music rights, and what insurance you can't shoot without. Available on Amazon under Carol Dean and at FromTheHeartProductions.com. I want to remind our listeners that David Raiklin is a brilliant and talented award-winning musician who scores films and can compose music for a trio or for a full orchestra. David is a very good friend to the independent filmmaker and comes highly recommended by From the Heart Productions. If you need music to help tell your story, please contact him at davidraiklin.com. That's David, RAIKLEN.com. And Carol and I want to thank you for tuning in to The Art of Film Funding. Please visit our website at FromTheHeartProductions.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Good luck with your films, everyone.